Hey guys, tonight we're not exactly booking a cozy retreat. Imagine peeling back the layers of time, skipping the whole airport security nightmare. You just arrive. Pop. One moment you're perhaps curled up in your favorite chair, soft blanket, maybe the next you're blinking. In the bright, unfamiliar glare of what ancient Athens calls its midday sun. Not a tourist in sight with selfie sticks, thank goodness. But also no paved streets, no familiar language hitting your ears, and definitely no scent of freshly brewed coffee. What hits you instead is a dizzying cocktail of animal waste, stale sweat cooking fires, and something you can't quite identify but immediately wish you couldn't smell. You've traded your predictable comfort zone for a sensory assault and a profound sense of, oh dear, you probably won't last a day here, not without a serious adjustment or a miracle. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're listening live or can be bothered to drop a comment with where you are and what time it is. I love seeing how far these little trips travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take a tentative step forward. Your modern, perhaps sensible footwear is immediately caked in dust and something squishy that you really don't want to think about. The ground isn't level, it's packed earth worn uneven by countless feet hooves, and the occasional clumsy cartwheel. People are everywhere jostling, shouting in Greek, a language that sounds utterly alien, and much faster than those audio lessons suggested. It's noisy. A blacksmith's hammer rings nearby. A vendor hawks wares in a sing-song yell you can't decipher. A goat bleats in protest as it's herded through the throng. And somewhere a dog is having a philosophical argument with thin air. There's no real sidewalk. No orderly queue, just a swirling, messy flow of humanity and livestock going about their business. You try to orient yourself looking for street signs, landmarks. Anything familiar? There are none. Just buildings made of sun-baked brick or rough stone, many with thatched roofs that look perpetually on the verge of catching fire, huddled together without any discernible pattern from your perspective. This is Athens, ostensibly the cradle of democracy, the beacon of philosophy and art. Right now it feels more like a particularly pungent and confusing street fair that never ends. You clutch instinctively at your pocket for your phone, useless obviously. You look for a helpful local. Everyone looks busy, potentially suspicious or utterly uninterested in your bewildered expression. A cart piled high with amphorae rattles past the driver, shouting a warning you don't understand just in time for you to yank your leg back to avoid being run over. You stumble, regain your balance heart, hammering a little. Okay, physical navigation is going to be harder than you thought. It's not just crowds. It's crowds with things moving through them unpredictably. No painted lines, no traffic signals, just an organic, chaotic ballet where knowing the choreography is the price of not getting flattened. You notice details now. The air doesn't just smell bad. It's thick, almost chewy with airborne dust smoke, and let's just stick with various organic compounds. Your eyes water slightly. It's hotter than you expected, even in the shade cast by overhanging awnings. And there's a constant buzz of flies. Not just a few, but legions swarming around spilled goods piles of refuse, tucked into corners or not tucked at all, and any unfortunate animal product lying around. You reflexively wave a hand in front of your face, feeling slightly ridiculous but also deeply unsettled. You thought arriving would be a moment of quiet observation. Instead, you're plunged directly into the deep end of sensory overload. One mainstream historical fact to latch onto in this overwhelming scene is the Knicks. While you're wandering this messy marketplace chaos, the Knicks Hill is just a short distance away. This is where the assembly of Athenian citizens met. Think ancient parliament, where crucial decisions for the polis were debated and voted upon. Citizens, by the way, didn't mean everyone. You had to be a free adult male of Athenian parentage on both sides. Women slaves and resident foreigners medics had no political voice in this democracy. So, while you're choking on the fumes, remember that just over there, fundamental Western political thought was being hammered out by a select few who presumably had slightly nicer villas further away from this immediate mess. As you try to gain your bearings, you notice how things are built. Forget straight lines or planned urban grids for most parts of Athens, aside from perhaps public spaces and later planned areas. Houses are higgledy-piggledy organic growth, driven by necessity and proximity. They open directly onto these messy lanes with maybe just a simple wooden door. No buffer zone, no garden unless it's an internal courtyard you can't see from here, just wall opening onto chaos. It feels incredibly public and exposed, yet simultaneously you can't see into anything. There's a disconnect between the public mess and the private lives happening behind those blank walls. Here's a slightly quirky tidbit that might make you cringe. Ancient Athenians used small ceramic or pottery shards called ostraca as ballots during a process called ostracism. This was a rather dramatic political move where citizens could vote to exile someone they considered a threat to the democracy for 10 years. People would literally write the name of the person they wanted to exile on a broken piece of pot. So the next time you see a shard of broken pottery in a museum collection labeled ostraca, remember it was essentially an ancient negative political endorsement slipped into a voting urn, literally trash repurposed for political mudslinging. It gives a new meaning to throwing shade. You tentatively approach someone who looks slightly less harried, maybe a vendor sitting by their stall of figs. You try a hopeful hello, followed by a garbled attempt at what you think might be an ancient Greek greeting. They stare at you blankly, perhaps assuming you're a particularly strange silent foreigner, or possibly deaf. Language barrier check? Add that to the list of survival hurdles alongside hygiene, traffic, and general cluelessness. Communication is going to rely heavily on gestures, which given your current level of stress might mostly involve wide eyes and panicked pointing. This whole blending in strategy is going spectacularly poorly. It's fascinating though, isn't it? To stand here where figures we only read about, Socrates, Plato, Pericles, walked these very, well, perhaps not this exact squalid patch, but certainly nearby paths. They navigated the same urban environment, dealt with these smells, though presumably were more accustomed to them and probably knew how to avoid getting trampled by a goat. You feel profoundly disconnected from that world, despite literally standing in it. There's a significant scholarly debate actually regarding the extent of planning in Athenian residential areas. While public spaces like the Agora and Pnyx show deliberate design, historians still argue whether residential areas outside the city walls or in certain Deems districts exhibited any degree of organized layout, or if they were largely organic self-built agglomerations, just adding rooms and structures as needed without an overarching plan, much like this confusing cluster you find yourself in. Looking around organic agglomeration feels like an accurate, if rather academic description for this wonderful mess. The immediate priority is survival. Find water, hopefully cleanish. Find shelter, figure out how to not smell quite so much like everything else, and definitely avoid anything that looks like a public latrine area. Good luck finding one that doesn't look exactly like that. Your romantic notions of philosophical debate in leafy groves have evaporated about as quickly as clean air here. Right now, it's just you versus the Athenian urban jungle, and the jungle seems to be winning. You watch a child chasing a scrawny chicken kicking up more dust, adding to the visual and olfactory assault. You swallow hard. Day 1. Hour 1, probably. This is already intense. So you stand there covered in Athens' finest dust and mystery mix, eyes wide. Navigating this isn't just about getting from A to B. It's about micro decisions every single second to avoid a physical mishap. You take another tentative step this time, focusing intensely on the ground right in front of you. It's a minefield. Aside from the animal deposits, there are discarded odds and ends. Pottery shards, watch out sharp edges, broken pieces of wood, possibly decaying organic matter that you try very hard not to look at directly. There's also the sheer unevenness. Forget perfectly flat pavements. This is a patchwork of dips, bumps, loose stones, and sudden holes where perhaps a makeshift drain is, or just where the earth has eroded or been dug up and never properly filled in. Walking feels less like a simple action and more like a continuous series of minor acrobatic maneuvers. You're constantly scanning the ground, then glancing up, then scanning the ground again. Because the threats aren't just underfoot, you have to watch out for things happening around and above you too. Picture this, you're concentrating on not breaking an ankle on a hidden rock, and suddenly a fellow pedestrian barrels past you, carrying a long plank of wood horizontally over their shoulder. Narrow miss. Then, as you step near a building wall, you hear a splash. Someone up on an upper floor. Yes, buildings could be multiple stories, though often shabbily constructed, has just casually emptied a chamber pot or discarded waste out of a window into the alley below. Delightful. You instinctively flinch away your survival instincts, screaming a horrified EW. It makes you appreciate the wonders of indoor plumbing and building codes more than you ever thought possible. Maybe even building codes for hanging signs securely. Is that sign made of painted wood swaying precariously overhead? Could a strong breeze send it crashing down? Better shuffle past quickly. This casual disposal of waste from above wasn't just a random occurrence. In some dense urban areas, it was unfortunately common practice turning the streets into unpredictable open sewers. It makes dodging errant livestock feel like a pleasant afternoon stroll by comparison. You try to stay alert, your head swiveling like a nervous pigeon's. Every noise makes you jump a little. Is that a runaway cart, a panicked animal, or just someone loudly haggling? Your modern senses are overwhelmed, keyed up by the constant low-level threat. Remember how simple it is to just walk down a sidewalk back home right now that feels like a distant, unimaginable luxury. Here, the street itself is an active participant in trying to impede your progress or possibly cause you grievous bodily harm. You mentally tally the things you've had to avoid in the last 5 minutes. 3 patches of significant animal manure, 1 near collision with a person carrying something pointy, 2 areas that looked suspiciously like open sewage, and what might have been a dead rat or something equally appealing in the gutter. Just a casual Tuesday stroll, ancient style. Speaking of gutters, the concept of managed drainage in residential areas was often rudimentary or non-existent. Rain turned packed earth pathways into mud baths and potentially channeled effluent right down the middle of things. And when the sun came out, everything dried aerosolized and added to the already robust bouquet. It's not just an aesthetic issue, it's a serious health hazard. Puddles of stagnant, contaminated water were breeding grounds for all sorts of unpleasantness, which we'll definitely get into later because, oh boy, are we going to talk about illness. But for now, just surviving the physical environment is job number 1. Don's favorite shoes are already looking like they've gone 10 rounds with a swamp creature. That reminds me, need a new pair. Or perhaps just invent waterproof boots 3 millennia early. Probably easier to just watch where you're stepping. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The famous street known as the Panathenaic Way ran through the Agora, the central public space marketplace, up to the Acropolis. It was likely better maintained than the minor residential streets you're currently traversing, possibly even paved or packed hard and regularly cleaned, especially during major festivals like the Panathenaia. Think of it as the ancient Athenian equivalent of their main ceremonial road. While it might offer slightly easier walking terrain for a stretch, it would also be bustling and chaotic with people, processions, vendors, and various activities, presenting its own set of dodging challenges, albeit perhaps fewer spontaneous chamber pot showers than the back alleys. So even the nice streets were still ancient streets. There's also the presence of working animals everywhere. Not just goats and chickens you might encounter in outer areas, but donkeys, mules, and oxen used to pull carts or carry loads. They move on the same roads as people leave their traces everywhere and can be unpredictable. Trying to pass a grumpy donkey loaded down with ceramics in a narrow lane feels like playing a game of chicken where the donkey holds all the cards and you're constantly bracing for a kick. Or just stepping in what it just left behind. Gentle joke number 2. Why did the donkey cross the road to add another obstacle to your difficult commute? It feels that personal sometimes. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit about getting around while carts and wagons existed. Personal transport options like horses for regular travel within the city might have been less common for the average person due to cost stabling issues in crowded areas and frankly how utterly unsuitable many of these narrow winding lanes were for wheeled traffic. Most people walked or used donkeys, mules for carrying goods. The sheer volume of foot traffic, animal traffic, and rudimentary carts sharing the same space contributes massively to the unpredictable flow and the necessity of constant vigilance. It really underscores that movement itself was physically demanding and risky, not the passive act it often is for us today, where we just hop in a car or on a train. Trying to negotiate this labyrinth of uneven paths and spontaneous obstacles is utterly exhausting. You can feel the tension in your shoulders, the constant assessment happening in your brain. Is that pile of straw hiding a hole? Is that dog friendly, or is it going to snarl at you? Will that teetering stack of goods outside a shop fall over? Everything requires conscious effort and awareness. It's mentally draining in a way that your modern daily commute probably isn't unless you live somewhere with particularly aggressive pigeons or notoriously bad potholes. Actually, ancient potholes were probably epic. You consider sitting down for a moment to just breathe and process, but finding a clean surface to sit on seems like an insurmountable challenge. Besides, stopping in the flow of traffic might be more dangerous than moving. Historians still argue whether formalized traffic rules or pedestrian safety regulations existed in a meaningful way in ancient Athens or other Greek city-states, beyond perhaps decrees related to the width of specific public roads or limitations on certain types of carts in certain areas. While there might have been some customary practices or localized rules enforced occasionally, there doesn't seem to be evidence of comprehensive urban planning centered on pedestrian safety in the way we understand it. It was largely left to the individual to navigate the perils of the environment. Your personal survival was well personal. So you're entirely on your own out here, folks. You continue your wary shuffle forward. A sudden loud yell makes you freeze. Someone is clearly upset about something gesturing wildly nearby. You don't know if it's just an argument, a robbery, or something else entirely, and frankly, you don't want to stick around to find out. Discretion feels like the better part of not getting involved in whatever local drama is unfolding. Your instincts scream, avoid conflict. Moving away from potential trouble leads you down another narrow, twisty path that looks slightly darker thanks to buildings leaning in over it. It seems dodging death might be less about following a path and more about continuously selecting the least dangerous option presented in that split second. It's giving choose your own adventure, but every choice seems to involve mud poop or getting bonked on the head. Okay, joke number 3. What do you call an ancient Athenian who successfully crossed the street elderly? A little dark. Maybe, but navigating this mess, it doesn't feel entirely inaccurate. This is exhausting, and you still haven't figured out where to find some clean water. Or dinner. You've dodged the donkey dung, sidestepped the dubious puddles, and successfully avoided becoming roadkill ancient style. Your stomach, however, is starting to complain rather loudly. All that stress and physical exertion has left you hungry, and the sheer novelty has worn off just enough for basic needs to assert themselves. Time to think about food. Walking through the marketplace, if you manage to find the agora or a smaller local one, gives you glimpses. There are stalls selling figs, grapes, pomegranates in season, and dried fruits. There are sellers with baskets of vegetables, leeks, onions, garlic beans, lentils, cabbage, various greens. Someone might be selling chunks of cheese, maybe goat or sheep. Over there, skewers of small grilled fish sizzle over coals looking perpetually on the verge of incineration. There's the smell of baking bread, but it doesn't smell like your favorite sourdough. It's rougher, grainier. The dominant smells are often strong. Fermentation from wine frying fat or oil animal odors and underlying, well, just the smell of lots of stuff and people packed together with minimal hygiene. Forget popping into a convenient shop for a sandwich or prepackaged salad. Your food options are limited and tied directly to seasonality, local production, and your meager ability to communicate and afford anything. For the average Athenian, the diet was centered around what historians call the Mediterranean triad cereals, mostly barley olives and grapes. Barley was the absolute staple, not wheat bread as fancy as we know it. They ground barley to make maza, a kind of thick paste or porridge or flat cakes often cooked on a hot stone or griddle. Sometimes barley flour was made into paxomadia hard rusks, twice baked for preservation. Picture your breakfast cereal, but unsweetened, much coarser and requiring chewing that might loosen your teeth. This was the foundation of most meals. It was filling but profoundly beige. Then there were olives, essential not just as food, but for olive oil used in cooking, lighting, and personal care. The taste of ancient olive oil might be stronger or more peppery than modern mass-produced versions. You'd eat cured olives, of course, salty and maybe a little bitter. Grapes were eaten fresh or dried as raisins and crucially turned into wine. Water in populated areas was often suspect. Public fountains and wells could easily be contaminated, especially with the casual attitude towards sanitation you've already observed. So wine often heavily diluted with water to make it less alcoholic for general consumption throughout the day was a much safer bet. This explains why wine wasn't just for parties, it was a necessary hydration strategy. Drinking pure water was essentially playing microbial roulette. A light joke, knock knock. Who's there? Barley gruel. Barley gruel, who eboy. Barley gruel ready to eat this for the third time today. Yeah, the humor was probably different. Meat was a rarity for most people. It wasn't consumed regularly by the lower classes, mostly eaten during religious festivals when animals were sacrificed, and then the meat shared or sold. If you got meat, it might be from a goat, sheep, or pig. Poultry wasn't hugely common compared to today, though they had chickens and geese. Small birds were sometimes eaten. Seafood, particularly small fish, was more accessible in coastal cities like Athens, especially salted fish which could be transported and stored. This salted fish was a crucial source of protein and flavor, though intensely salty. Vegetables and legumes filled the gaps. Lentils, beans, peas provided protein. Onions, garlic, cabbage, and other greens added variety and flavor, and sometimes made the gruel more palatable. Fresh fruit was seasonal and a treat. Figs, both fresh and dried, were very important for their sugar content and nutritional value. Other flavorings came from herbs, vinegar, and garum. Here's where things get potentially weird. Garum was a fermented fish sauce made by layering fish, often small ones like anchovies, with salt and letting it ferment in the sun for months. The resulting liquid was a powerful, salty, umami-rich condiment used everywhere like ketchup or soy sauces today. The smell was robust, to put it mildly. Thinking about the process might make your stomach churn a bit, but for the ancient palate, it was gold. Definitely a quirky fringe tidbit. The centrality and production methods of garum were fascinating and sometimes frankly appalling from a modern perspective. It was valuable and traded widely. Preparation was simple. Food was boiled into stews. Pulse was a common type of gruel or porridge, thickened with legumes, grilled or baked. No fancy ovens or multi-burner stoves. Cooking fires inside homes could make air quality poor. Storage was another challenge. Without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly, especially meat and fish in the Athenian heat. Preservation methods relied on drying fruits, fish salting, fish meat, pickling, and using olive oil or honey to cover things. Grains were stored in amphorae or pits, always under threat from pests and damp. A mainstream historical fact regarding Athenian food relates to the cytometry officials who oversaw the grain supply, particularly the import of grain. Athens relied heavily on grain imported from regions like the Black Sea area because Attica couldn't grow enough to feed its population. Ensuring a consistent and affordable grain supply was a constant political and logistical challenge, vital for preventing starvation and unrest. The stability of the state literally depended on ships bringing barley and wheat back to your plate, or more likely wooden bowl. You managed to procure some barley gruel, probably slightly watery, maybe flavored with some strong onion, and perhaps a hint of ancient oregano. The texture is lumpy, the taste bland, rescued only slightly by the sharp onion or garlic. You nibble on a rock-hard piece of Paximedion, wondering if you're supposed to dunk it in the gruel to soften it. Many did, or just brave the dental challenge. A few dried figs offer a desperately needed burst of sweetness. You eye the grilled fish skewers. They smell promising, but the swarm of flies around the vendor's stall makes you hesitate. Is it worth the risk given the hygiene standards or lack thereof you've observed? Probably not. You picture yourself violently ill later, far from anything resembling a toilet or modern medicine. Let's stick to the gruel. Gentle joke number 3. What did the ancient Athenian farmer say about dinner? It's going to be the same thing tomorrow. Yes, mealtime could be a bit monotonous. You look around wondering what else might be available. Are there snacks? Maybe some roasted chickpeas or beans if you're lucky? Something fried in oil. Probably, but everything feels risky. You long for a simple, clean bottle of water. Unbottled drinks might be wine diluted, maybe pasca, a drink made from vinegar and water that Roman soldiers loved, but similar concepts existed in Greece or iffy water. You try pointing at a fountain, attempting the Greek word for water you half remember. Someone nods understanding and points to the fountain near the edge of the agora. You approach it with trepidation. It looks like water, but you recall the animal traffic, the refuse, the general air of biological unsortedness. You stand there thirsty but also deeply hesitant. Is the risk of known disease worth the relief of quenching your thirst? Historians still argue whether dietary differences between various social classes were strictly based on wealth and access, or if there were also ingrained cultural or religious reasons for preferring certain foods or limiting others beyond price. Was the rarity of meat for the poor purely economic or also tied to religious sacrifice being the primary legitimate way for meat to enter the communal diet? It's complicated, likely a mix of both economics and custom. What is clear is that the daily diet for the vast majority was far less varied, less palatable by modern standards, and required significant effort to prepare compared to yours. As you contemplate your culinary options, gruel hard bread, iffy fish, maybe some onions, you realize how much you take food safety and variety for granted. Eating here isn't a pleasure. It's a basic necessity fraught with potential discomfort or outright illness. You carefully lift your bowl of lukewarm beige gruel. At least it's unlikely to give you instant food poisoning. You hope. You eat quickly, less for enjoyment and more for survival. This energy will be necessary for continuing to not last a day here. One bite. Chew. Chew. Chew the tough grain. Sigh internally. Gentle joke number 1. Recontextualized. What's on the menu tonight? Surprise, it's barley. It was always barley. You scrape the bowl with your finger table manners are probably flexible and look up. Okay, food taken care of. Now about that constant itchy feeling and the smell of something foul sticking to your skin. You've managed to get some sustenance into your body. A small victory, though perhaps a rather bland one. Now, with the immediate hunger pangs muted, other sensations become more prominent. The grime that accumulated from your short time wandering is pervasive. You feel it on your skin, gritty under your fingernails, clinging to your clothes. And that smell, it's not just the street smell, it's a deeper, more personal funk that seems to be emanating from everywhere and settling on you. Let's be blunt. Ancient hygiene was probably not what you're used to. Modern ideas of daily showers, deodorant-flushing toilets, and soap-based cleansing rituals simply weren't part of the average person's life in ancient Greece. Personal hygiene existed, but it looked very different. For instance, soap as we know it, hard bars made from animal fats and lye, wasn't common, although similar substances were known and used for washing clothes or treating illnesses. For personal cleaning, people often used oils, particularly olive oil. You'd rub yourself down with oil, which would help loosen dirt and sweat, and then scrape it off with a curved bronze or iron tool called a strigil. Athletes in particular would do this vigorously after exercise, mixing the oil and sweat and dust into a kind of paste that was then scraped away. Imagine scraping yourself down instead of lathering up. It gets you clean in a way, but it's perhaps not the refreshing cleanse you're used to, and you're left a little oily. Gentle joke number 1. Why did the ancient Greek use a strigil? Because he wanted to be clean, scrape, and shiny. Bathing wasn't usually a daily event for most. People might wash their hands and face more frequently, but a full-body bath might only happen occasionally, perhaps weekly, maybe less often depending on circumstances. Public bathhouses existed in some Greek cities and became much more prominent later in the Roman period, but early Greek ones might be simpler facilities. Homes might have had a simple hip bathtub, but heating enough water was laborious and expensive, consuming fuel that was likely needed more for cooking. So water was precious and full body washing a considered effort. Your personal freshness levels would fluctuate dramatically. That persistent underlying scent on everything and everyone. Yeah, it was likely a mix of stale sweat body odor without deodorant or effective soap. Whatever oil people used or didn't use cooking smells, clinging to clothes and just the ambient smell of a city with rudimentary sanitation. Clothing wasn't washed nearly as often either. Garments typically simple tunics. Chaitons made of linen or wool were probably washed less frequently than yours, perhaps by fullerers. Cloth cleaners using substances like live fermented urine, a source of ammonia or various types of earth or ash to clean and whiten textiles. This process was harsh and time-consuming. Daily wear items might simply be shaken out and reworn. Imagine wearing your current outfit for several days of physical labor and navigating dusty, dirty streets without any effective way to clean yourself or the clothing frequently. Yeah. The state of communal sanitation was often dire by modern standards. Toilets weren't ubiquitous features in homes like they are today. Wealthy homes might have some sort of rudimentary latrine, possibly draining into a cesspit or a public drain if one existed nearby. But for the vast majority of the population living in smaller, simpler houses, toilet facilities were either communal shared latrines or, frankly, wherever you could find a discreet enough corner. An alleyway, an empty plot, or sometimes into the very streets you're trying to walk on. Chamber pots were certainly used especially indoors, but the contents then had to be emptied somewhere. And that somewhere was frequently out into the street or a refuse heap. As mentioned before, casually dumping waste out of upper-story windows into the street was not unheard of in denser areas. This contributed massively to the smells, the presence of flies and rats, and the spread of disease. Drains existed in Greek cities, particularly around public spaces like the agora or for rainwater runoff. Athens had some significant underground drainage systems, but these were primarily designed for rainwater and possibly effluent from public buildings or specific privileged properties, not for general household sewage from residential areas. These drains often emptied into waterways directly outside the city walls, carrying contaminants with them. A mainstream historical fact here is the existence of sophisticated water management systems like aqueducts and public fountains built by the Greeks to bring fresh water into the city from springs or rivers. This highlights a dichotomy. The Greeks put effort into securing clean water sources, but often lacked effective systems for removing wastewater in a way that didn't contaminate the urban environment where people lived, drank, and ate. They were good at step 1 getting water, but not always at step 2 getting waste out safely. Animal waste, as you've already keenly observed and stepped in, was another constant layer of grime in the streets. With livestock moving through the city and being kept within urban limits or on the periphery, their droppings were just part of the urban landscape. There was no organized street cleaning service like modern sanitation departments. Cleaning up was sporadic and possibly relied on rainwater to wash some of the surface muck away and into drains or waterways, moving the problem, rather than solving it or individual efforts outside their own properties. Gentle joke number 2. What did the ancient Athenian sanitation worker say job security? Except there really wasn't one in the way we think of it. The streets were cleaned primarily by scavenging animals, insects, and the weather. The air you breathe carries not just dust and cooking smoke, but the constant effluvium from decaying waste. Your sense of smell, likely hypersensitive since you arrived, is constantly assaulted. There was undoubtedly some acclimatization for locals. Things that smell overpoweringly foul to you were perhaps just the smell of the city to them. But adaptation doesn't eliminate the source of the odors or the health risks they represent. Every breath feels a little less clean than you're used to. You find yourself holding your breath near certain alleys or refuse piles. It's exhausting. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. While they lacked modern soap, the Greeks and Romans who adopted similar practices were fond of perfumed oils after cleaning. They might have scraped with the strigil rinsed if possible, and then applied scented oils made from various plants and flowers. This was likely more common among the wealthier classes, but it suggests a desire to smell better than the baseline city aroma. However, applying perfume doesn't remove dirt and bacteria, so while you might smell a bit of flowery oil near a wealthier individual, it was layered on top of everything else. It wasn't a substitute for washing. Gentle joke number 3. What was the ancient Greeks' favorite perfume eau de fermented fish sauce? Or maybe flower oil if they were fancy. It certainly made an impression one way or the other. This level of general grime and poor waste management had direct consequences for health. Contaminated water sources and the presence of human and animal waste near living spaces are perfect breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites. Diseases spread easily through fecal-oral routes, impacting digestive health severely and frequently. We'll get more into illness later, but the stage is set by these basic sanitation realities. Historians still argue whether average personal cleanliness standards declined or improved significantly over time across different periods of Greek history or compared to contemporary civilizations. Some scholars argue that Bronze Age Minoans or Mycenaeans had quite sophisticated plumbing in their palaces, while classical period residential areas might have lagged in terms of widespread access to such amenities. It's complex to assess average practice versus elite exceptions, or compare across vastly different settlement types. What seems consistent is that public hygiene and personal cleansing practices differed fundamentally from modern standards. Standing here, itching a bit, breathing cautiously, and feeling generally grubby, you have a deep appreciation for treated water and flushing toilets. Every clean surface back home, every easy access to soap and water, every rubbish bin you've ever used suddenly feels like part of a vast, underappreciated miracle. You manage to find a basin with water near a public fountain, presumably for hand washing, although the water source itself is still potentially problematic. You hesitantly cup some water and rinse your hands, scraping a bit with a thumbnail in lieu of a strigil. It helps minimally, providing a temporary gritty respite. Okay, surviving the dirt is one thing. But if you manage to make it through this without catching some kind of stomach bug or skin infection, it will be another modern-day miracle layered upon the historical reality. Next hurdle. When, not if, you inevitably get sick. Despite your best efforts to dodge the visible sources of filth, to breathe shallowly, and to select the least unappealing-looking gruel it happens, your stomach decides it's profoundly unhappy with your adventure, perhaps rebelling against that suspect water you risked near the fountain, or maybe just the sheer glorious microbial diversity of ancient Athens. Or maybe it's that unsettling itch that's gotten worse. Anyway, you feel awful. A wave of nausea hits you, followed by stomach cramps that would make you long for modern antacids and probiotics like you long for indoor plumbing. A fever creeps in, leaving you shivering one moment, sweating buckets the next. You are definitively sick. Back in your own time, this might mean a quick trip to the doctor, a prescription for antibiotics or antivirals, perhaps some electrolyte drinks and a few days off work binge-watching TV shows until you feel better. Here, that infrastructure simply doesn't exist. Forget hospitals with sterile environments, nurses, and diagnostic equipment. Ancient Greek medicine, even at its most advanced points, was a different beast entirely. And your access to even that would depend on where you were, your social status, and sheer luck. Most people would first turn to folk remedies passed down through generations. Herbal concoctions, poultices, dietary advice or restrictions, and various superstitious practices. If you were sick, someone in your family or community would likely try to help, based on traditional knowledge, which was a mix of genuinely effective plant-based medicines, complete nonsense, and practices that might actually harm you. Imagine someone offering you a strange-smelling herbal tea that tastes like dirt, mixed with bitter weeds, insisting it will purge the humors causing your illness. You would probably sip it desperately, having no other options. Gentle joke number 1. Patient doctor, I have a terrible cough. Doctor, try this tea made from boiled spider webs. Sips tentatively. Did I mention I also feel like throwing up? Alongside folk medicine, there was religious healing. Temples to deities like Asclepius, the god of medicine, were important centers for seeking cures. You might undertake a pilgrimage to a famous Asclepieion like the one at Epidaurus, too far for your sick self right now, or a local Athenian one. Here, healing often involved rituals, prayers, sacrifices, and incubation. sleeping in a sacred dormitory called an abaton. Supposedly Asclepius or his sacred snakes might visit you in a dream and either cure you instantly or reveal the treatment needed. Imagine lying there feeling miserable and feverish, desperately trying to have a dream that saves your life surrounded by other, equally sick and hopeful people. Not exactly a restful or hygienic environment. Then there were practitioners. Some ancient physicians were beginning to approach medicine more rationally, developing theories about health and disease, based on observation and natural causes rather than solely on divine intervention or superstition. The most famous name associated with this is Hippocrates of Cos, often considered the father of Western medicine. Hippocratic medicine was based on the theory of the four humors blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to be caused by an imbalance of these humors. Treatment often involved trying to restore this balance through methods like dietary changes, exercise purgatives to make you vomit or induce diarrhea, lovely or even bloodletting, cutting a vein to drain some blood, which was seen as removing excess humor. This is a mainstream historical fact. The humoral theory dominated Western medical thought for centuries, though its effectiveness by modern standards is highly debatable, and some treatments like vigorous purging or bloodletting for many conditions were likely more harmful than helpful. So if you could find and afford a physician who followed these newer principles, you might get slightly more reasoned advice, perhaps a carefully chosen herbal remedy or instructions on diet. But there were also charlatans, people claiming medical skill who might employ ineffective or dangerous treatments. Distinguishing between them wouldn't be easy for a confused sick foreigner. And sterile practices, anesthesia for surgery. Understanding of germs, none of that existed. Surgery was possible for external injuries like broken bones or wound, but highly risky due to infection, lack of pain control, and limited understanding of internal anatomy. Your fever worsens. You feel achy all over. The cramps are relentless. You describe your symptoms as violently unpleasant and scary, but communicating them accurately in ancient Greek, nearly impossible. You'd probably resort to pointing at your aching stomach, miming nausea, and collapsing dramatically. Someone takes pity on you. They offer you something. Maybe that spiderweb tea, maybe a poultice made of mashed herbs and warm something or other for your stomach applied directly to your skin. You might be told to fast or perhaps forced to eat a very specific, unappetizing food. Every sensation is amplified by the fever. The smells you thought were bad before, now they're unbearable. The hardness of the floor or mat you're lying on, certainly not a comfortable modern mattress, feels agonizing against your sore body. Sleep is elusive, disturbed by discomfort and anxiety, a quirky or fringe tidbit. Ancient Greeks sometimes used electric torpedo rays, a type of fish that can produce an electric shock to treat headaches or gout. They would place the live fish on the patient's head or affected limb to deliver shocks which was believed to have therapeutic effects. Imagine having a slightly less than lethal electric fish applied to your head to fix your headache. While it might have produced a sensation or distraction, its actual effectiveness is, let's say, debatable. But people tried anything if they were desperate. Gentle joke number 2. Why did the electric fish break up with his girlfriend? Because she couldn't handle their charged conversations. Ancient medicine was serious business, gotta lighten the mood somehow. This is perhaps one of the most terrifying aspects of not lasting a day here, the sheer helplessness in the face of even minor illness or injury. A cut that gets infected could be life-threatening. A fever could kill you. There were no safety nets you rely on. Your body's own strength combined with maybe some questionable remedies or hopeful prayers was all you had. Pain relief was minimal. Willow bark was known for its aspirin-like properties, but it wasn't always used or easily accessible in a processed form like a pill. Suffering through severe symptoms was often unavoidable. Historians still argue whether certain documented ancient Greek medical practices were genuinely based on accumulated empirical observation of effectiveness even without understanding the why, or primarily rooted in philosophical theories or ritualistic beliefs that had little actual therapeutic value. It's hard to separate what might have helped, like using certain plants with mild medicinal properties, from practices that were either useless or actively harmful, like excessive purging. The balance between proto-scientific observation and ingrained superstition is debated. You lie there feverish in pain, covered in grime smelling. Well, like you live in ancient Athens and are also currently ill. The noises of the city penetrate your makeshift sickbed. The distant shouting, the bleating of animals, the endless buzzing of flies now seeming even more menacing. You drift in and out of uncomfortable consciousness, wishing more than anything for a sterile hospital room, an IV drip, and a nurse. Gentle joke number 3. Doctor, take 2 of these herbs and call me in the morning. Patient, which herbs? Doctor, doesn't really matter. You probably won't feel anything by then anyway. Grim humor. Yes, but facing ancient illness would be a grim reality. This certainly doesn't feel like restful bedtime history. This feels like a historical horror movie you can't wake up from. Surviving illness in this environment required not just resilience, but extraordinary luck against ubiquitous pathogens. Assuming against the terrifying odds presented in Section 5 that your immune system or sheer luck has managed to fend off the worst of the Athenian pathogens, and you are slowly shakily recovering. The fever breaks, the worst of the stomach distress subsides, leaving you weak and deeply grateful for no longer being on the verge of perishing in a back alley. But now that the immediate biological crisis has passed, you're faced with the ongoing challenge of navigating the social landscape. And this perhaps unexpectedly can be just as perilous as the physical one. Because while physical threats might announce themselves with smells or sounds, social faux pas can be subtle, misunderstood, and carry consequences you wouldn't anticipate. You're an obvious outsider. Your clothes are wrong, more on that later. Your accent or total lack of understandable speech marks you instantly as foreign, and your body language and customs are fundamentally different. Even simple interactions are fraught with potential missteps. How do you address someone? Do you use gestures? What about eye contact? Different cultures have different rules about politeness, respect, and public behavior, and ancient Greece is no exception. What seems friendly or normal to you might be seen as rude, disrespectful, or even threatening here. Gentle joke number 1. Why did the foreigner blush in ancient Athens because he accidentally offered to buy a man's cow instead of asking for the time? Achyide, social status matters profoundly, even if it's not always immediately visible through dress. Citizens had rights and privileges that differed vastly from medics, resident foreigners, and even more so from slaves. Navigating interactions requires an understanding of this hierarchy which you completely lack. For instance, you wouldn't address a prominent citizen like a politician or wealthy landowner in the same casual way you might approach a fellow foreigner, or someone of lower status like a craftsman or vendor. Getting it wrong could range from mere social awkwardness to causing serious offense, potentially even leading to legal trouble or violence if you significantly disrespected the wrong person. Imagine accidentally being overly familiar with a grumpy politician who thinks you're undermining his dignity. Not a recipe for a long stay. Public behavior had its own unspoken rules. Drunkenness, for example, while common among certain groups or during specific festivals, could be viewed negatively if displayed inappropriately by individuals, particularly citizens expected to maintain a certain decorum. Walking around openly brandishing money might make you a target for petty theft, which the authorities might not prioritize investigating. Engaging in loud public arguments, depending on the context, could draw unwanted attention or even legal action for disturbing the peace. The boundary between lively public life and disruptive behavior was defined by customs you don't know. Religion permeated daily life, and accidentally disrespecting local deities or religious practices could cause immense offense to the devout Athenians. You might stumble upon a small shrine or altar in an unexpected place, in the street inside a doorway. What is the appropriate behavior? A respectful pause. An offering. Ignoring it could be seen as impious, which was a serious charge in ancient Athens. Sacrifices to the gods were common. Witnessing one, which often happened publicly or semi-publicly, required a certain understanding of protocol. Mocking religious beliefs or actions even inadvertently through your confused or skeptical reactions would be incredibly unwise. A mainstream historical fact about this is the prosecution of individuals for impiety as abeia. The most famous example is the trial and execution of Socrates, in part for allegedly corrupting the youth and not recognizing the city's gods. This demonstrates that offending religious sensibilities was no minor matter. It could have fatal consequences. Interaction with women would be particularly tricky. Athenian women, especially citizens' wives, were generally expected to be modest and spend most of their time within the home, participating in public life only in specific contexts like religious festivals. Publicly addressing a respectable Athenian woman who is not a close family member might be seen as highly inappropriate, or even an insult leading to trouble with her male relatives. Public spaces were predominantly male domains. This isn't to say you wouldn't encounter women going to the well marketing, etc. But the nature of those interactions would be different from what you're used to, demanding a different kind of restraint and formality you wouldn't naturally possess. Gentle joke number 2. Tourist, excuse me, miss, can you tell me the way to the Acropolis? Athenian man, how dare you speak to my wife, guards? Okay, maybe not guards instantly, but certainly a severe scolding and possible fisticuffs from her husband or male relative. Your unfamiliarity extends to property rights. In this world without clear street numbers or maps, boundaries and ownership of land or even movable goods are understood locally but mysterious to you. Accidentally wandering onto someone's private property, even in seemingly empty courtyard, or picking up something you think is abandoned but isn't, could be interpreted as trespass or theft. There's no concept of finders keepers in the way you might understand it. Everything likely belongs to someone, and taking it without permission or infringing upon their space would have repercussions. Politics was woven into the fabric of Athenian society, at least for male citizens. Public life was inherently political. Getting involved in local disputes or expressing opinions about public affairs without understanding the complex factions and loyalties at play would be incredibly naive and possibly dangerous. Imagine casually stating an opinion on a political figure you only know from vague overhearings, only to realize you've just insulted someone standing next to you who is a staunch supporter of that person. The casual political chatter of modern life would be highly risky here. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit related to Athenian social norms. While known for intellectual debate, certain topics or types of speech could lead to ostracism, as we discussed earlier with the potsherds, or accusations if perceived as too arrogant, boastful, or harmful to the community or its values. They valued moderation, sophrosine, and excessive displays of wealth pride. Hubris or controversial ideas that seemed to challenge core beliefs could make you a target politically and socially. So you couldn't just loudly share all your futuristic opinions about democracy, science, or equality. Discretion and understanding the prevailing mood were essential skills you completely lack. Gentle joke. Number 3. What's the fastest way to get exiled from Athens? Walk into the agora and declare you don't believe in talking things to death. The system of justice and law was also drastically different. If you did accidentally cause offense or break a rule, the legal process wasn't like modern courts with professional lawyers, judges, and police investigations in the way you understand them. Justice was often more public community involved and could be summary, particularly for non-citizens or minor offenses. Self-help resolving disputes through direct action, sometimes violent, was also a significant factor in some cases. Finding someone to advocate for you if you were accused would be difficult, expensive, and your status as a foreigner would put you at a significant disadvantage. Historians still argue whether Athenian social rules and legal frameworks were genuinely applied equitably across different social classes and citizenship statuses, or if wealthy citizens were often able to leverage their influence to evade consequences that would be severe for the poor or for metics and slaves. The degree to which written laws match daily social practice and enforcement is a subject of ongoing scholarly debate, making it hard to definitively say how a specific misstep might be treated in any given situation. But it's safe to assume being poor and foreign stacked the odds against you. So even as you recover physically, every social interaction, every move you make in public feels like navigating a complex maze blindfolded. You are constantly scanning for clues, trying to understand expressions and gestures, and probably making a string of minor or major social blunders you aren't even aware of. Simply surviving the disease isn't enough. You also have to somehow avoid making an enemy, stepping on political toes, insulting a god, or talking to the wrong woman in the wrong way. It feels like one wrong word. One misunderstood look could land you in deep, irrecoverable trouble, all while still probably not feeling 100% slightly itching and desperately wishing for clean clothes. This is mentally exhausting on top of everything else. The rules are invisible, the stakes feel high, and your ignorance is profound. Time to try and find a place to shelter somewhere private, where you can perhaps recover further without inadvertently offending anyone. So, you've decided wisely that minimizing your public interactions is the best path forward for survival, at least until you figure out the local operating manual for not causing offense. That means you need shelter. Finding a place to rest, a sanctuary away from the prying eyes and potential social pitfalls of the streets, feels incredibly urgent after navigating illness and societal complexities. You look at the buildings around you. They seem to offer refuge, but getting inside and figuring out where to get inside, that might offer even a modicum of safety and privacy, is the next hurdle. Typical Athenian homes, particularly for average citizens or medics, weren't grand affairs like temples or public buildings. They were relatively small, simple structures, built of humble materials. Mud brick on stone foundations, timber framing walls possibly plastered with mud or clay, and roofs often thatched with straw or reeds, or sometimes tiled with fired clay tiles. From the outside, they could look quite unassuming, often presenting blank walls to the street with maybe just a single doorway. Windows, if they existed on the ground floor street side, were usually small and placed high up for privacy and security. This isn't like walking down a modern street with big plate glass windows. These homes are fortresses against the outside world, albeit rather flimsy ones by our standards. Entering a house would likely mean passing through that simple doorway, maybe into a small vestibule before reaching the heart of the typical Athenian home, an open courtyard all. This is your mainstream historical fact about Athenian housing. The central courtyard was a defining feature of many Greek homes. It was often open to the sky, providing light and ventilation to the surrounding rooms, and served as a multifunctional space for domestic work, religious rituals at a small household altar, and sometimes keeping small animals like chickens. Rooms typically opened directly onto this courtyard. There weren't long internal corridors like in modern houses. The rooms themselves would be small and basic. Furniture was sparse, perhaps low wooden beds or couches Klinai used for reclining at meals, or for sleeping, simple tables, chests for storage, and perhaps some stools. Floors might be packed earth, sometimes covered with rush mats. Walls were possibly plastered or whitewashed, maybe decorated with simple painted designs in wealthier homes, but likely plain in most. The overall impression would be one of functional simplicity, built more for shelter from the elements and a modicum of privacy than for comfort or aesthetic luxury. Imagine living in a series of small boxes arranged around a patch of open ground with minimal soft furnishings or decorative touches. It certainly makes your living room feel palatial in comparison. Gentle joke number 1. Why did the Athenian buy extra long blankets? Because his house had more drafts than a political debate. Heating in winter was provided by small charcoal braziers or open fires in certain rooms. But these were smoky, inefficient, and carried a significant risk of fire in structures made largely of flammable materials like timber and thatch. Proper chimneys were not common. So in winter, you'd be cold, damp, and breathing in smoky air. In summer, the packed earth walls might keep the interior cooler than the outside, but without effective ventilation beyond the courtyard, the heat could still be stifling, especially with cooking happening indoors. Comfort was secondary to basic shelter. You definitely miss your thermostat right now. Sleeping conditions were likely basic. Forget sprung mattresses and plush pillows. You'd probably be sleeping on a low wooden frame with woven string or leather straps. Perhaps topped with mats stuffed with straw or wool, or maybe just directly on mats on the floor. It would be hard, potentially itchy if the straw had guests, and definitely less comfortable than your bed at home. You wake up stiff and sore from the unfamiliar hardness, adding another layer of physical discomfort to your historical ordeal. And then there are the unwelcome cohabitants pests, with structures made of porous materials, minimal sealing, and food storage not being airtight ancient homes, were irresistible to various creatures. You'd share your living space with mice and rats, which could damage property, contaminate food, and spread disease. Insects were everywhere. Flies were a constant buzz in any home drawn to food scraps and general living conditions. Mosquitoes would be a problem particularly near any standing water source. And then there were the delights of bedbugs and fleas, which would make your sleep even less restful and leave you constantly itching. Imagine the constant low-level irritation of biting insects and the scuttling sounds of rodents behind walls, if there were even hollow walls or just solid mud brick where they might burrow into night after night. Your peaceful modern night's sleep, filled with the hum of the refrigerator, seems a million miles away. This constant low-level warfare with pests was just a fact of life. Gentle joke number 2. Pest control in ancient Athens. Get a cat, if you can feed it and if it's not already carrying diseases. Cats were present, but perhaps not always the pampered indoor variety we know. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit about these structures. Excavated remains sometimes reveal lead or terracotta pipes within wealthier homes, hinting at attempts at bringing water indoors or having some form of private drain. But these were exceptions. Even with these pipes, wastewater still needed to go somewhere, often into a pit within the property, or joining an external, possibly open drain, contributing back to the lovely street environment. This level of domestic engineering was not widespread. For most homes, going to the nearest public fountain or well for water and dealing with waste via chamber pot emptied outside were the norms. Your nightly trip to the bathroom suddenly feels like a journey into luxurious, safe solitude compared to emptying a ceramic pot into the street or visiting a dubious shared latrine, possibly in the dark. More on darkness later. Security was also a concern in these houses. Simple wooden doors and potentially small windows made homes vulnerable to theft. Wealthier individuals might have thicker doors or more secure chests for valuables, but the average home offered limited protection. Sleeping on a hard floor wasn't just about comfort. It was in a structure that felt very permeable to both the elements and unwanted intruders. Living space was also often incredibly cramped, especially for larger families or households that included enslaved people. Privacy was minimal even from other household members. Sections of the house, particularly certain rooms around the courtyard, were often designated for women's use gynaeconitis, while others were primarily for men's activities and drawn. But this separation might be more theoretical or applicable only in wealthier homes with sufficient space. Historians still argue whether this spatial segregation between men's and women's areas was a strictly observed feature of most Athenian homes or primarily an ideal depicted in literature and applicable mainly to the elite. The reality in smaller homes was likely less defined and more about shared space out of necessity. The overall feeling of occupying one of these houses after being out in the urban environment would be one of temporary reprieve but not true restfulness by your standards. The basic needs of shelter are met, but you are constantly aware of the discomfort, the hardness of the surfaces, the scratchy texture of your clothes, which likely smell, well, like everything else, the ambient temperature being less than ideal. The knowledge that unseen or occasionally seen pests are sharing your space, and the lingering damp, earthy smell mixed with wood smoke, and perhaps faint traces of the outside world's refuse. Surviving here isn't just about avoiding fatal illness or social execution. It's about enduring constant, low-level physical discomforts and environmental irritants that erode your well-being. Your clean, pest-free, climate-controlled home back in the 21st century is an almost unimaginable marvel of engineering, sanitation, and accumulated comfort compared to this basic shelter. You lie down on your uncomfortable mat, listening to the night sounds maybe, the skittering of a mouse, the drone of mosquitoes outside the open courtyard, the distant sounds of the city filtering through the simple walls. Gentle joke. Number 3. What's the real Attic Greek horror story? The one about the bedbugs that organized? It's a constant battle. You don't have the tools to win definitively. You just hope that whatever pathogens got in while you were sick aren't enjoying their new, rather grimy habitat too much. Okay, shelter secured such as it is. Time to think about the physical toll just living here would take beyond dodging things in the street. You managed to pass a rough, uncomfortable night battling itching and hard surfaces, and maybe the sounds of little feet scurrying. You wake up stiff, unrested, and still vaguely smelly, but lying around all day recovering wrapped in your presumably sweat-stained, ill-fitting tunic isn't really an option for long-term survival. Because lasting a day here means figuring out how to function in this economy and environment, which relies almost entirely on manual labor. Unless you miraculously arrived with a chest of gold and figured out how to use it safely, and convince someone it's legit, you'll need to contribute to work just to secure enough food, and potentially a slightly less terrible place to sleep tomorrow. Basic survival tasks that are effortless conveniences for you are significant physical efforts here. Take water, for example. You're thirsty after your feverish night and there are no taps. Getting water means going to a public fountain or a well. If you're living on the outskirts or even just a few blocks away, that means a walk. Possibly downhill or uphill, carrying heavy pots, hydria, or buckets. A single large hydria could hold 20-30 liters weighing maybe 20-30 kilograms, 44-66 lbs when full. Women and slaves primarily did this laborious task daily, often multiple trips for one household. Imagine doing several rounds of carrying that weight balanced on your head or hip over uneven, dusty ground in the heat. It's demanding repetitive physical work just for essential hydration and domestic use cooking. Minimal washing. Your muscles would ache, your back would protest, and your hands might blister from rough handles. This isn't hitting a button. It's serious exercise required multiple times a day, every day. Gentle joke 1. What was the ancient Greeks' favorite gym routine? Carrying water uphill both ways. Food preparation is another layer of manual effort. You might have acquired some barley or grain. Turning that into edible maza or flour for cakes requires grinding it often, using a saddle quern, a large stone slab, and a smaller stone rubber, or a rotary quern. 2 circular stones, one rotating over the other, often operated with a handle. This process is incredibly laborious and time-consuming, requiring repetitive arm and shoulder movements for hours to produce enough flour for a meal or two. Then you need fuel, wood or charcoal, to light a fire and cook the food. Collecting fuel was yet another physical task. Pounding spices or herbs with a mortar, and pestle to add flavor, more manual effort. Absolutely everything requires significant physical input. Forget modern kitchen appliances, microwaves, or even basic pre-prepared ingredients. If you needed to work outside the immediate domestic sphere to earn your keep or produce goods that work, was also intensely physical. Agriculture, which supported much of the population directly or indirectly involved. Manual plowing with ox-drawn plows still required walking behind a heavy animal controlling an implement. Sowing seeds by hand. Manual weeding, harvesting with sickles. Threshing grain, beating it to separate the kernels, often done with flails, or by animals trampling it and winnowing. Tossing the grain in the air for the wind to blow the lighter chaff away. All under the sun, back-breaking repetitive work with simple tools. Imagine spending a day bent over a field exposed to the elements without the promise of mechanical assistance. Your hands would be raw, your back would scream, and exhaustion would set in long before sundown. This constant cycle of agricultural labor tied to the seasons was a defining characteristic of the ancient world, a mainstream historical fact that underpinned Athenian society's ability to feed itself, supplemented by imports, of course, as mentioned before. Even craftwork required significant physical strength and stamina. A blacksmith hammered hot metal all day. A potter worked clay by hand or foot-powered wheel. A stonemason chipped and shaped rock. A weaver operated a loom, a demanding process depending on the loom type. Building structures, transporting goods, It was all muscle and leverage aided by rudimentary tools, but nothing like the machines and engines that amplify human power today. Imagine trying to move even moderately heavy objects, build a wall, or saw through thick timber with ancient tools. It puts your last furniture assembly project into perspective. Gentle joke. Number 2. How do you identify an ancient Greek craftsman? Ask to see their calluses. Actually, don't ask, you'll probably see them anyway. This level of pervasive physical exertion would be utterly draining to your modern body, unaccustomed to such constant demanding labor for basic needs. You likely sit for large portions of your day, use vehicles or public transport to get around, and employ tools or machines for most tasks that require force or repetition. Transitioning instantly to a world where getting a drink, eating a meal, or earning your survival requires continuous, heavy manual labor would leave you utterly spent within hours. Your muscles would fatigue rapidly, your stamina would be non-existent by ancient standards, and the sheer cumulative effect of daily chores would be crippling. A quirky or fringe tidbit about this manual labor is related to the ingenuity within the constraints. While powered machinery as we know it didn't exist, Greeks did develop surprisingly clever, simple machines based on levers, pulleys, and screws. For example, the Archimedes screw, though later Hellenistic, was used for lifting water, making that specific task slightly less backbreaking where available. Cranes powered by human treadwheels were used in construction to lift heavy stone blocks, involving individuals literally walking inside large wheels to provide the power. So while everything was manual, there were some clever technological assists developed over time to make specific heavy tasks marginally more efficient or possible with group effort. It was innovation born from necessity within the limits of muscle, wind, or water power. The sheer exhaustion would affect everything else too. Decision-making after a day of hauling water and grinding grain probably impaired. Alertness to dodge street hazards. Lower. Ability to resist illness. Diminished due to physical strain. You would likely collapse onto your uncomfortable sleeping mat, utterly drained each night, too tired. Even for philosophizing or appreciating the distant Acropolis if you could see it. Sleep wouldn't be a restful 8 hours. It would be a necessary oblivion punctuated by discomforts, but oh so needed after the day's physical demands. There is a significant scholarly debate regarding the precise nature and extent of manual labor performed by free citizens, in contrast to enslaved people or resident foreigners, medics. While wealthy citizens often lived off the labor of enslaved people or tenant farmers, many average citizens, especially small landowners, farmers or those involved in crafts and trades, undoubtedly performed substantial physical labor themselves. Historians still argue whether manual labor carried a significant social stigma across all levels of free society, or if certain types of skilled craft work were respected while the most arduous repetitive tasks were largely relegated to enslaved people. The reality is complex and varied depending on individual circumstances, but manual labor was undeniably a pervasive feature of life for a huge proportion of the population. Your personal experience would likely involve hard physical work, regardless of hypothetical status, unless you were somehow dropped directly into a position of extreme wealth with ready-made staff, which is extremely unlikely. Consider the lack of protective gear as well. No steel-toed boots, safety glasses, ergonomic tools, or sunblock. Remember that crocodile dung idea from other history? Not appealing here either. You work in your basic clothing exposed to the elements using tools that are effective, but require brute force and precision, often acquired through years of practice. Accidents, cuts, bruises, sprains, broken bones from falls or dropped objects were frequent and, as we've discussed, incredibly difficult to treat effectively. Your vulnerability to physical injury through labor adds another constant layer of risk. Your hands ache, your shoulders burn. And the idea of doing this again tomorrow and every day after that feels overwhelming. Surviving isn't just passive endurance. It requires actively performing exhausting tasks in an environment ill-suited for modern, softened bodies. Gentle joke number 3. What did the ancient Athenians say after finishing a day of fieldwork? Fetch me the mildly irritating herbal poultice, please. It's a world built on muscle and sweat, and yours needs rapid adjustment, or it will give out. You curl up hoping the sheer physical fatigue will counteract the uncomfortable bedbugs. Sleep is calling a temporary escape from the ache. So you're aching dirty, potentially recovered from ancient gastric distress, and deeply aware that your modern physique is laughably unprepared for the daily grind of fetching water and grinding grain. Now, let's address something else that contributes significantly to your overall misery: what you're wearing, and your general state of groomedness. Forget performance fabrics, comfortable undergarments, perfectly fitted clothes, or your sophisticated toiletries bag. Your ancient Greek wardrobe and beauty routine are going to be Spartan in the uncomfortable sense. Basic Greek clothing for both men and women, centered around the tunic-like chiton and a rectangular cloak, the haimashon. The chiton was essentially a piece of fabric linen or wool draped around the body and fastened often at the shoulders and down the arms with pins, fibulae, or sewn. It could be belted at the waist. The haimashon was a larger piece of fabric wrapped around the body, often leaving one shoulder free. These garments were not tailored or cut with seams and darts to fit specific body contours like modern clothes. They were based on draping simple rectangles of cloth. This is a mainstream historical fact. The fundamental simplicity of pattern cutting and the reliance on draping large pieces of woven fabric are hallmarks of ancient Greek clothing construction. Think of wearing very large pinned sheets that you had to arrange just right. This lack of tailoring meant they could feel bulky, shift around awkwardly with movement, and certainly weren't designed for maximum comfort during vigorous physical labor. Gentle joke number 1. Why did the ancient Greek politician keep tripping? His haimashon had more policy positions than pleats. The materials themselves would be far removed from the soft, smooth fabrics you're used to. Wool could be coarse and itchy, especially undyed or roughly processed. Linen was finer and better in heat, but still different from modern equivalents. Neither had the stretch moisture-wicking or quick-drying properties of contemporary fabrics. Imagine doing physically demanding work in scratchy wool in the Athenian heat. Chafing would be a constant companion. Laundry was a huge, infrequent chore done manually, as discussed before. Your clothes would hold onto dirt, sweat, and smells tenaciously, quickly becoming stiff and unpleasant after 1 or 2 wears without washing. You probably have that constant feeling of slightly sweaty, stiff, scratchy fabric clinging to you, amplifying every itch and discomfort. Footwear options were simple too. Sandals were common, essentially soles of leather or plant fibers tied onto the foot with leather straps. While better than nothing, these offered limited protection from the uneven, dirty, object-strewn ground. Imagine stepping on a sharp rock, or worse, one of those charming pottery shards ostraca, in your sandals. Closed shoes or boots existed, but were less common for everyday wear for many. You'd probably experience more cuts, bruises, and general foot soreness than you're used to, and the lack of socks in the modern sense means the sandal straps might chafe against your skin directly, and your feet would accumulate a layer of grime very quickly. Grooming was a vastly different concept. As we touched upon before, cleansing relied on oil and scraping, not soap. There was no deodorant. Body odor was likely significantly more prevalent, both on yourself and everyone around you, masked perhaps only slightly by expensive perfumes used by the wealthy. Dental hygiene basic. Chew sticks or rough cloths might be used to clean teeth. Maybe rubbing abrasives like ash, but modern toothpaste, toothbrushes, and regular dental care were non-existent. Bad breath was probably common. Hairstyling and care water, and maybe some oil. Combs and pins existed, but elaborate modern haircuts and coloring were out, and dealing with greasiness or dryness was limited to natural remedies. You would likely have a perpetually lived-in look, your hair getting greasy or dusty depending on its type, your teeth feeling less than sparkling clean. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. Those pins, the fibulae used to fasten chitons at the shoulders and arms, could be quite elaborate. Decorative items in themselves, often made of bronze or even precious metals for the wealthy. They weren't just functional fasteners, they were a form of jewelry. However, a simple chiton for an average person might just use plain functional bronze or iron pins. Misplacing a fibula could lead to your garment flapping open awkwardly, which could be embarrassing depending on the situation. Imagine trying to keep your draped tunic secure while also carrying a heavy pot of water, or grinding grain if your pin came loose. Dyeing clothes was possible using natural dyes from plants, minerals, or shellfish like the incredibly expensive Tyrian purple from murex snails. However, achieving vibrant, consistent colors was difficult and expensive. For many average Athenians, clothing might be the natural color of the wool or linen, off-white, beige, brown, or gray. Vivid colors would mark someone of higher status or indicate special occasion clothing. So your typical outfit might be quite muted and earthy, adding to the overall feeling of practicality over panache. Gentle joke number 2. Why did the ancient Greek wear beige? Because they spent all their money on fabric and dye was too much trouble. Or maybe they just ran out of snails. The lack of comfort combined with the continuous dirt sweat and insufficient washing contributes significantly to a persistent feeling of being unclean, itchy, and physically ill at ease. You'd probably be subtly adjusting your clothing all the time, scratching those persistent itches, bed bugs, wool general grime, and feeling a constant background level of physical annoyance. The effort required just to feel passably presentable by ancient standards would be considerable and likely still fall short of what you consider basic cleanliness and comfort. Historians still argue whether there was significant regional variation in clothing styles and materials across different parts of the Greek world, or how much influence climate differences, say, between Athens and a colony in southern Italy had on typical daily attire. While fundamental garments like the chiton and haimation were widespread specific ways of fastening belting and arranging them as well as preferred fabrics, might have varied more than our sources explicitly detail, making definitive statements about the typical outfit universally applicable across all Greek city-states slightly challenging. However, the core principles of draping simple cuts in common materials like wool and linen remain generally accepted. Surviving the day includes surviving this continuous low-grade physical discomfort caused by your attire and lack of modern grooming. It's not as dramatic as dodging a cart or facing a deadly disease, but it's a constant drain on your well-being, adding to the stress and unpleasantness of your historical misadventure. Your clean, comfortable t-shirt and jeans, even worn and faded, suddenly feel like futuristic miracles of textile technology and daily hygiene are a forgotten utopia. Gentle joke number 3. What do you call a well-dressed person in ancient Athens? Someone whose fibula isn't poking them. Ouch. Every little detail of your new physical existence in this ancient world seems calibrated to make you uncomfortable. Now how to cope when the sun goes down and the relative safety of daylight fades, as the relentless, dusty Athenian sun finally begins its descent. Painting the sky in hues that probably look beautiful but are honestly a little lost on you right now, because you're mostly just aching and tired and sticky. Another reality sets in. Day gives way to twilight, and twilight fades rapidly into something your modern eyes are profoundly unprepared for: real, deep, consuming darkness. This isn't like twilight back home where streetlights click on and illuminated signs hum, and the glow of the city keeps the night at bay. As the sun dips below the horizon, the limited light sources of ancient Athens become apparent, and their inadequacy is significant. For the average person, artificial light sources were primitive and expensive. The most common was probably the terracotta lamp burning olive oil. These were small vessels with a spout for a wick made of flax or similar fiber, and a reservoir for oil. They gave off a flickering, weak, smoky light, casting deep shadows. A single lamp might illuminate a small room dimly, but it wouldn't fill a space with light like even a low-wattage modern bulb. You'd need multiple lamps for anything but the smallest area, and they consumed precious olive oil, a valuable commodity. Wealthy individuals might have more elaborate bronze lamps, but the principle was the same: a small flame struggling against the vastness of the night. Torches might be used outdoors, particularly in processions or by those traveling, but these were smoky, required fuel, and offered temporary flickering illumination. This lack of widespread effective lighting fundamentally changed the nature of life after sunset. Forget going out for a casual evening stroll. Browsing shops, they'd be closed, or popping to a friend's house across town unless absolutely necessary. Once darkness fell, most people retreated indoors. The streets became significantly less populated and significantly more dangerous. Navigating the already treacherous, uneven ground without sufficient light is incredibly risky. You'd be stumbling over potholes, tripping on loose stones, walking into unseen obstacles, and rediscovering those delightful patches of organic matter via unfortunate sensory experiences you'd rather avoid. Finding your way in the dark labyrinth of unlit alleys and paths would be nearly impossible if you didn't know them intimately. The darkness didn't just hide the physical hazards of the streets, it also provided cover for human dangers. Crime, particularly theft and assault, was a much greater risk after dark. Without streetlights or a pervasive organized police force patrolling constantly, the night offered anonymity to those with ill intentions. Imagine hearing footsteps approaching in the absolute dark. You can't see who it is, how many there are, or their intentions. Your instincts would likely scream, "Find cover." Why? Getting jumped, robbed, or otherwise attacked while fumbling your way through a dark alley is a very real possibility. Your modern assumption of public safety at night is predicated on ubiquitous lighting and visible law enforcement presence, neither of which exists here. A light joke to momentarily deflect from the terror. Why did the ancient Athenian bandit carry an olive oil lamp so he could see what he was stealing, and also blind his victim slightly? Inside the basic homes described earlier, the situation wasn't much better in terms of feeling secure from external threats because of the darkness. Simple wooden doors could be barred from the inside but weren't exactly steel reinforced. Walls were mud brick, windows were small but possibly unbarred or just shuttered. If someone did try to break in during the night, relying on the darkness outside to approach unseen, your primary defense would be alerting neighbors with shouting, which is reliant on people hearing you over the night sounds or their own limited light sources. The lack of exterior lighting around homes also makes them vulnerable. There are no security lights clicking on no brightly lit porch deterring approach. The protective bubble you associate with your locked, well-lit home simply isn't here. This means nighttime was often a period of relative immobility and heightened anxiety outside the confines of known domestic space. Most activity stopped. Socializing happened earlier in the day or was confined to indoors with limited light. Your evening might consist of huddling by the flickering light of an oil lamp, the sounds of the night, perhaps stray animals, distant shouts, or just the wind and the rustling of thatch, amplified in the visual void. The limited light sources might also make domestic tasks more difficult, things like mending clothes or reading if you were literate, which most weren't challenging for the eyes. Gentle joke number 2. What did the ancient Greek father say before bed? Blow out the lamp, find a bedbug, and hope the criminals trip. Here's your mainstream historical fact about navigating ancient Greek city spaces at night. While the casual stroller might be vulnerable, watchmen or patrols did exist in some form in Greek cities. Athens had a body of Scythian archers partially used for policing duties, and free citizens also sometimes took turns as watchmen, especially around important public buildings or gates. However, these patrols were limited in number, and coverage certainly not providing constant surveillance over the entire city grid, which, as you know, wasn't a grid anyway. They were more about deterring major disruptions and guarding key sites than ensuring individual safety in every alley. Their presence wouldn't alleviate the pervasive risk of petty crime or stumbling injuries in the unlit, unpoliced residential areas. Your senses would adapt, or rather you'd rely more heavily on hearing in the dark. The night wouldn't be silent. Distant human voices, animals moving about, maybe the sounds from a late symposium or a male drinking party, one of the few social activities that often took place in the evening within private homes. But the lack of visual confirmation for those sounds would be unsettling. Was that rustling a rat or something larger? Was that distant shout part of a revelry or someone in trouble? A quirky or fringe tidbit about ancient lighting, while oil lamps were common fireflies. Yes, the glowing insects are sometimes mentioned in ancient Greek texts, possibly as a source of minor ambient light, or just as fascinating natural phenomena observed during warm nights. Using them practically as lighting is dubious, but their mention highlights how any natural source of light at night could be notable in a world lacking artificial luminescence beyond basic fire and oil lamps. Imagine trying to catch enough fireflies to read by. Actually don't. It's silly and would give you something else to itch from. Gentle joke number 3. ancient Greek pickup line in the dark? Is that the moon? Or did you just bring another oil lamp because you're glowing? Barely. Historians still argue about the true levels of nocturnal crime and the perceived safety of city streets at night for average people in different periods and cities. While literary sources often depict nighttime as potentially dangerous, especially for individuals returning from late-night events like parties, assessing the statistical reality across the population is challenging due to limited data. Some scholars emphasize community structures and neighborhood familiarity might have offered some degree of informal safety in certain areas, while others highlight the consistent potential for peril outside of known safe spaces, particularly for those perceived as vulnerable like strangers or slaves. The scholarly debate reflects the difficulty in truly reconstructing daily experiences in the absence of things like crime statistics. But relying on informal safety structures when you're a total unknown doesn't sound like a solid survival strategy. You are deeply instinctively afraid of the dark in a way you haven't been since childhood, precisely because it harbors so many unseen dangers. Every noise makes you tense up. You move slowly and cautiously, even indoors with a small lamp, intensely aware of the unlit corners and spaces beyond its weak glow. Trying to get comfortable on your scratchy mat in your dirty clothes, swatting occasionally at potential insects, you can only hear all under the oppressive cloak of ancient darkness. Outside the thin walls of your simple shelter is another profound discomfort layered onto your historical reality. It adds mental stress to the physical exhaustion and general unpleasantness. Surviving the night requires not just sleeping through it, but remaining alert on some level to sounds, feeling exposed to the hidden world outside. The comfort of secure, illuminated nights back home feels incredibly painfully far away. Your one consolation is that at least it offers a temporary escape from the visible chaos and constant need to dodge things. But the darkness adds a new layer of peril.